Well, it's about 5:30, so we'll get started. So thank you for coming to the author talk this evening. We're very excited to have Harry here and tell us his story about his father and the journey it took to write this book. And you'll be taking some questions at the end.
Oh, absolutely.
And we'll see how it goes. So thank you. Yay!
Hi, well, hi everybody. My name is Harry Haldt, or more completely, it's Harry Peel Haldt III. The third comes into play, and you'll understand what that is. So do all the Harrys. So I live in Fitchburg. We moved here a couple of years ago from Haldt. Over my lifetime, I have lived in 14 different places. So by 8th grade, I had lived in 5 different places, a couple of moves in the military, a bunch of moves once I started my career, and so here I am in Fitchburg. All this stuff plays into the story of this book, and I'm going to kind of explain a little bit of this as I go along. The biggest part, or the biggest player, is this box right here. This is a box that I got 2 of these from my mother. After my father passed away, my parents lived in Florida, and she moved back up to New York, and I was living in upstate New York at the time, and she said, you know, Trip is my nickname, and that's where the third comes in, Trip for triple. Because when I was born, all 3 Harrys lived in the same town. So we couldn't all be called Harry. So my grandfather went by the Harry, my father went by Peel, and I was either Haldt, the last name, or I had to be something else. So my grandmother came up with Trip for triple. That's where the third comes in. Anyway, my mother moved back up and said, you know, I've got some boxes of family stuff we had, your dad and so forth, and you should probably have those. So why don't you come on over and get some boxes? So I did. She had 2 boxes like this, and she said, you know, you can go through them and we'll family stuff, and I said, sure. Take them out of your attic. I took them back to my house. I put them in my attic, saying I will get to them, and of course, did I ever get to them? No, I never got to them. So a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, my wife and I were getting ready for a yard sale. So we were going through boxes, pulling stuff from here and there, and these boxes were included in that list. So she said, you know, why don't you, while we're doing all this, why don't you go through those boxes that your mother gave us? You know, we haven't really looked at that stuff. I said, sure, okay, great. So she was looking for yard sale stuff, and I started to go through these boxes. So I opened up this box, and there's 3 issues of Life magazine from the 1940s, a 1919 issue of the Saturday Evening Post, 2 scrapbooks that my mother had kept from my father when he was in the Army, World War II, a scrapbook of my life from age 0 through high school, manila folders like this, 3 cigar boxes full of stuff, all these ledgers and record books, a couple of other books, all kinds of stuff. And okay, my parents' wedding album, what other kind of stuff was in there? Their wedding album, a book of cartoons that my father drew, all kinds of stuff. So I'm going through, and I finally come to a folder that says, Story, written by H.P.H. Jr., and just a folder just like this. So I said, okay, this is kind of interesting. What is this? So I opened it up, and what I found was a typed draft of this book, just like this. And as I started looking through all the stuff that was in the book, in this box, what I found were these ledgers, which I thought were ledger books, were actually diaries. These cigar boxes are full of letters that my father wrote. So I said, what is all this stuff? So what the story is about my father as a high school and college student in the 1930s, living in northern New Jersey, who during the summers of high school, 1-year prep school, and 4 years of college, 7 of those summers he went somewhere. 5 of those summers he worked on board ships, 5 different kinds of ships. He worked on board a small freighter, a sailing schooner, a fishing trawler, a private yacht, the largest private sailing yacht in the world at the time, and a round-the-world cruise liner. 2 other summers he went to Europe. 1 summer he spent bicycling around Holland, another summer he spent bicycling around England. So those 7 out of the 9 summers, that's what he did. The other 2 summers, not sure. I think he had injuries. He was a high school, he was a track guy. I think he had an injury in one of those summers and didn't go somewhere, and the other one was in college. He was a skier. I think he had a skiing accident. I remember him telling me something about that. But I didn't know much about all this. Every once in a while I'd hear a sea story or 2 and he would tell that, but you know, that wasn't much. He was kind of a quiet guy. So I start reading, and I read through these books, and I read through these ledger books, which I found out were his diaries, and I came across all kinds of black negatives, big old negatives like this, and okay, that doesn't help me much, so I took all these negatives down to a print shop and had them printed up. So I now had a whole bunch of black and white photos. I didn't know what they were, because the negatives weren't labeled, so I didn't know what they were. I then had some little 35mm prints, little square pictures, had those, didn't know what those were either. It looked like some of them looked like him, it looked like ships, but I didn't know what any of them were. These cigar boxes, all 3 of them, full of letters that he wrote back and forth to his parents while he was away. So I spent about 6 months reading all of this stuff. I read his draft, I read through all his diaries, I read through every letter in those boxes, looked at the pictures, and started to put together a picture of this guy as a kid, from 14 to 22 years old, doing this stuff during the summer. Now, I didn't know he knew that. As you both, I don't know how much you know about your parents when they were kids, what did they do, but I was quite surprised to find out what my father did as a kid when he was in high school and college. Okay, I mean, he was not the greatest student in the world, but he managed to get through. But he certainly was active in the summers and doing a lot of really exciting things. I then had to try and figure out, what am I going to do with all this? I have stories that he wrote, and they're stories of 4 of the 4 summers. They're on 4 different ships that he worked on. And some of these stories are funny. Some of them are a little sad. Some of them are really strange. Some of them are just somebody having a wild time, but really interesting. And I started to put together a picture, because I could now, by reading the diaries, reading this, and taking all these pictures that I didn't know what they were, they now started to make sense. Okay, this must be a picture of that because this is what he talks about. This must be a picture of that because that's the person that he's talking about. So that made sense. And I did the same thing with the letters. The letters and the diaries and the stories all kind of fit together. You know, somebody tells a bunch of sea stories and you say, well, yeah, okay, but how real are they? I mean, you can say anything, you know, sea stories are sea stories. But by the time I took that and compared that to what he wrote when he was doing it as a kid, I found out that the stories that he wrote about were actually in there. So, okay, they must have been pretty much the way they were, because that's what he wrote about them when he did them at the time. Okay, so that made sense. But why was my grandfather, his father, was a general sales manager for General Foods, worked in New York City. They lived in northern New Jersey, and I tried to figure out why was my father doing all of this stuff? Knowing my grandfather, pretty conservative guy, how did my father get to doing all this stuff, and why did he do this? Well, I found out because in amongst all these letters, I found a letter that my grandfather wrote to my father in 1932, just before he was leaving to go on his second summer. That's the summer he went to Holland and bicycled around Holland for 2.5 months. So I read through that letter, and it's in the beginning of the book, and I'm going to read to you a little bit of what it said because it was the aha moment for me when I read this. So this is my grandfather writing to my father, my 15-year-old father. Finally, on account of his manly, that is, gentlemanly actions, his papa and mama said to each other, "What a fine man we have made of this little bit of baby boy. We're not only proud of him, but also his girl, and he can be proud of himself. We have sent him to the West Indies, 1931, Holland, 1932, South Africa, 1933, England, 1934, the Mediterranean, 1935, Brazil, 1936, on a Gloucester fisherman, 1937, and Australia and around the world, 1938. Have put him through Dartmouth and given him a year at a European university. So let's sit back now and watch him go." So he wrote that in 1932. So my grandfather had a plan for my father for all of that time to do all of these things, to get to all these places. As he says earlier in the letter, the best way to find out about something in some place is to go there and do it. So he had a plan for it. And he did most of the things that he actually planned for. He never got to Brazil. He didn't go to Dartmouth. He went to Colgate, close enough. And he was accepted for graduate studies in Cambridge after he graduated from Colgate. He was going there for a year. That's another story. So my grandfather had a 9-year plan for my father. That's why he did these things. I would never have guessed that. I would have wondered forever why he did all those things without finding this. So this is one of the key letters of all the things that I found, is why my father did all these things, which made it okay. I still don't. It's not the father I know. I knew him when he was in his mid-20s. When I started to know him, I didn't know what he was like as a teenager. He didn't talk too much about it. He would tell a few sea stories here and there. We had some nautical things around the house, so that was fine. But I didn't really have any idea that all this had happened and was going on. So now I found all this stuff, and I said, okay, he got this far. What am I going to do with all of this stuff? I think this would kind of make an interesting, maybe a book, an interesting something. So I was living in Athol at the time, and I went to a local lady who works out there, who has a printing business, and I took all this stuff down to her and said, "What do you think? You think we can make a book out of all this?" And she looked at it and got back to me and said, "Yeah, I think we can. It'll take some work, but I think we can probably do something about it." So I spent the next 8 months putting this all together. So the book is a combination of the stories, the pictures, the logs, this, that, all drawings that my father had, all of those things. And it gave me a picture of someone totally different than what I knew. But I am so glad that my mother gave two things. That she, one, gave me the boxes, and two, I opened them. Because if I hadn't opened them and had never looked at it, like most boxes that sit in attics, they just sit there and they get shoved and moved from place to place. Somebody opens up, puts something else on top of it, closes it back up. And I'm glad I actually got through all of that, did it, pulled it out, and did something with it. So that's where this book came from. That's how it happened. So in here I tried to combine the stories, the pictures, the things, and I'm going to give you a few highlights of a few of these, and then I'm just going to answer questions, because some of these could go on forever. So the first ship that he worked on was called the Ring Fond. It was a small freighter, and it was a ship that went back and forth between Hoboken, New Jersey, and the Caribbean. It delivered and it brought coconuts back to Franklin Baker Coconut Division of General Foods, which my grandfather was the sales manager of. So my father writes the story. Now, he's 14 years old, his first summer. So these are stories, and you read the logbook in it. It looks like the handwriting of a 14-year-old. It's kind of hard to read, and it kind of sounds like a 14-year-old. The stories that are in the book are when my father wrote this when he was in his late 60s, so it's a little different. I was in high school at the time, 14 years old as I look back, pretty young. My sincere thanks to my mother and dad for letting me see the world from the deck of a deep water ship. She sailed out of Hoboken, New Jersey, where I immediately learned there was a saloon or bar on every corner. Our course was to Havana, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, the Corn Island off the coast of Nicaragua. We were there taking general dry cargo down and were bringing back coconuts for the Franklin Baker plant. My bunk was in the forecastle, was typically a narrow wooden bed with a side piece to keep you in place when heavy seas are running. The pillow had a unique smell all its own. Never before or since have I found an odor quite like it. Sort of a cross between wet chickens, eau de locker room, and diesel fuel. I can just imagine what that smelled like. I got to like it so much I actually missed it when I signed off. Pre-Castro Havana was a sailor's delight, and Harry's Bar was the place. Since they called me the Kid Pete, my shipmates had to buy me my Cuba Libre, of course, my first man's drink. For reasons better understood now than then, my initial shore leave was short, direct, and very inexpensive. Not bad for a 14-year-old on his own. Can you imagine sending your 14-year-old on a ship to Havana with a bunch of drunken sailors? No, I couldn't either. But my father managed to live through that and got through it, and nearly every sailor wears a knife. A sheath knife is as much a part of his work clothes as his pants or socks. One sunny afternoon, I sat on the forward hatch helping my friend carve a soft piece of wood. We got talking about knives, and he showed me a couple of good-sized scars. Then we got talking about knife fights, and the next thing I knew, my friend was teaching me how to knife fight. Little did I know then that I'd be wearing 2 knife scars before I quit the sea. And I remember him showing me his 2 knife scars, and now I know where they came from. That's not the story that I got when he told me about them, but now I know where that happened. This is still a 14-year-old kid. A couple of years go by, and now he's going to go on board a ship. This one, it's a sailing schooner. It's owned by the Grenfell Association. It went up along the coast, the eastern coast of Canada. And the Grenfell Association was set up to provide hospital care to the native Canadians. And so they had, one of the things they had is this ship would go up and it would just go from port to port to port. It would deliver, pick up, deliver to the next port, pick up, deliver to the next port, pick up. So that's what he did for the summer. And he was, as he called it in his story, he was a wop. Not what you think that is. The entire crew consisted of a professional captain, a chief engineer, and our beloved cook, along with 6 wops. I was a wop. The term has nothing to do with ethnic background. Rather, it means we signed on without pay. The hospital system worked the same way. A bunch of professional doctors and nurses and a whole passel of nurses in training nurses' aides, and future doctors, all willing to gain experience while enjoying the unusual. Eat raw blubber if you wish, watch the silent curtain of the aurora borealis, sweep across the night sky, jig for cod for dinner and evening, and listen to the Indians tell of their trapping experiences. Nothing like that at Rockaway River Hospital in Boonton, New Jersey. So that's what he did for a summer. And some of the pictures, some of the negatives that I had that I didn't know what they were pictures from that ship. There's one of a bunch of sailors stripped to the waist, shoveling coal. That's what they delivered to one of the ports, so they were shoveling coal off the ship. I was able to identify the skinny guy who was my father, who was there shoveling coal. So that was one place where I was able to take the story, the picture, put it together and figure out what this was and what this was all about. So a lot of it was hunting through a lot of these stories and reading, trying to figure out who these people were and what was going on. He writes about Cookie. Our Cookie was quite a character. Not only did he concoct meals out of nowhere, but he also had two special kettles on the back of the galley stove. One contained what he called coffee, and the other, he insisted, was tea. Both liquids were thick, black, and guaranteed to warm up a body as long as it was still alive. The contents of either pot also guaranteed that the drinker would be wide awake during his 4-hour watch, and maybe for some time after if one managed to swallow more than one cupful. Only by smell could we tell which was which. I can imagine what that stuff was, too. So this is of course a very mature 17-year-old this time, explaining this and spending the summer on a ship off of Canada. In 1936, he worked on board a Gloucester fisherman out of Boston. He was only on board for 3 weeks. It was one trip out to the Grand Banks, one trip back. He didn't write any stories about him, but he kept a logbook, and some of those experiences are quite something too. I'm not sure why he didn't write any stories. Maybe he just figured they weren't quite as exciting because it was such a short period of time. 1937, he's on board this sailing ship. It's a ship called the Sea Cloud, and at the time it was owned by Marjorie Merriweather Post and her husband, Edward F. Hutton. Marjorie Merriweather Post was the daughter of the gentleman who founded Postum Cereals. She was the heiress. When he died, she inherited General Foods. E.F. Hutton was a financier. Which was one wealthy person marrying another wealthy person, and they had this ship built in Germany. The Sea Cloud. At the time, it was the largest private sailing yacht in the world. Had 30 sails, 4 masts, a crew of 73 people. So my father signed on, was able to get on that ship. He had to get a special dispensation to leave his sophomore year at college a little early because the ship was leaving in April. So he managed to get that, had the things that he was required to have, and worked on board that ship. So he was one of 73 men. Of course, it was all male crew. And that ship then, at the time, Marjorie Merriweather Post had divorced Mr. Hutton, and she married a gentleman by the name of Joseph Davies, who was the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union. So in 1937, Ambassador Davies was on his way to visit the Baltic nations and to visit Russia. So he, his wife, and his daughter Nadina, 3 of them, and 73 men on board the ship, sailed across the ocean and delivered them and did the things that they needed to do. So 73 to 3, that's a pretty good ratio. I guess they got pretty well taken care of. Anyway, my father signed on board this ship and says, first day the bosun checked out his brand new seaman by telling him to climb the rigging of the towering mainmast. Now the mainmast I looked up was 175 feet tall. So here's a ship tied up to the pier, still tied up to the pier, So my father's going to show how much of a seaman he is, and he's going to scramble and run right up to the top. So he's climbing up the rigging, climbing wide, slanting ratlins, compares to something like climbing a great extension ladder leaning against the familiar side of a house. However, the last climb from the top of the upper topmast to the truck was a different matter. The tiny mast there did not measure much larger around than your arm, with the tarred rope ladder completely vertical, so you had to lean back to climb. I finally made it, hung tight, and made my first mistake. I looked down. Far below, on the little narrow deck that looked like a canoe from up there, stood the boatswain and a couple of other interested people, all with their heads thrown back, staring aloft. I guess they fully expected me to freeze and wondered which unlucky fellow would have to climb aloft to pry me loose and get me back to the deck. Something I had not counted on did happen, however. On deck, a slow, normal dockside roll becomes greatly exaggerated a couple of 100 feet in the air. I swayed in a good-sized arc, first out over the pier, and then out over the water, or so it seemed at great height. For the first time in my seagoing life, I got seasick while tied up to the dock. So then he ran back down, ran back to his cabin, threw up again, and then that was his first day on board this ship. So I can imagine how that went. So that was kind of an exciting thing that happened. He writes about Nadine Hutton. Nadine Hutton was the daughter of Marjorie Merriweather Post. I don't know if you know the name Nadine Hutton, but you might know Dina Merrill. Dina Merrill was Nadine Hutton. That was a stage name that she later took on. So the next day, they are now in the Baltic. They are, off Germany. The next day, we swung the ship's launches over the side and made fast to the boom. The owner's daughter and her party went ashore to a small island for a picnic and swim. The third mate, as launch captain, and I, as side boy, accompanied the guests' shore party. The rest of the crew went ashore with their launch and had their own party down the beach. I took some home movies, had the opportunity to chat with the guests, and spent the rest of the afternoon floating around about 1 foot off the ground. In later life, that attractive young lady became a leading movie star. I found that movie. In amongst all the things that he had, I found this 35 millimeter movie. I had that put on, at the time I had it put on tape. I looked at that and said, I wonder what this is. Having read that story, I know what that is. It's a picture of them romping around on the beach. These guys had their first break after sailing across the Atlantic. So that was kind of exciting to find out what that was. He writes on further, one afternoon we anchored near King Gustav's summer home. He was the tall, elderly, tennis-playing king of Sweden and had been invited on board the Sea Cloud. The passenger launch with the third mate at the helm and me in my capacity as boat hook handler went ashore to pick up the king and his party. They had just finished playing tennis, so they spent the time during the trip to the ship picking gravel out of the soles of their sneakers. He was plainly dressed in a blue jacket, white slacks, white cap with a visor, not what I expected a king to look like. The king asked me about where I went to school. When I mentioned Colgate University, he remarked that he knew about that New York State College. He had a nephew or some other relative that had visited there some years earlier and had come back with glowing and well-deserved reports. So not only did he knew about the school that my father went to, which is a little school in upstate New York, and my father was flabbergasted at that. So in among all of these pictures I found this picture, and this picture is the King of Sweden in the motor launch, being driven by my father and his crewmen back to the Sea Cloud to visit Mr. and Mrs. Davies. So when I saw this picture, I had no idea who this was. Here's an old guy sitting down on a bench You know, who knows? But again, being able to take stories and logs and pictures and put things together, it was another one of the things I could uncover. Who is this? And so that made that kind of exciting. And a lot of this book, a lot of these things are doing this kind of thing, you know, finding out what went with which, and that's what really kind of drove me and why I really why I wanted to take his stories and put this into a book form that had pictures and illustrations that went along with it. Because the stories are just one thing, but if you can hear it and see it at the same time, it made a lot of difference. So that's what I was attempting to do. In 1939, he now graduated. He's now a senior in college. He's 22 years old, and that summer, he worked on board this ship, the President Harrison, on a round-the-world cruise, 107 days. It left New York, went around the world, and ended up back in New York. And it was quite an experience. Let me just digress a second here. I will show you what that looks like, because he kept everything. Map of the President Liner World Service. Of course he would keep this. That's the cruise. That's where the ship went. Stopped in all of those ports, from New York, down through the Panama Canal, across the Pacific, through the Indian Ocean, up the Suez Canal, through the Mediterranean, back across, back to the United States. Now, lots of interesting things happened on this trip. Keep in mind when this was. 1939. Summer, 1939. Where do you think my father was on September 2nd, 1939?
Outside of Germany?
He was in Singapore, the largest British naval base outside England, the day that England declared war on Germany. So the ship is pulling into port while this is going on. He's halfway around the world on board a neutral American ship, and a huge British naval base. So the second half of the trip was kind of interesting. The first part was quite jovial and a lot of fun, and he talks all about it, and he talks about, I'll give you one little thing which is kind of fun. He was a steward on board the ship, and as he described it, that's the lowest of the low crewmen on board a ship. After a few invigorating days at sea, the boredom was such that anybody that wore pants was in demand, even young bellhops. A drop number on our coal board could and often did lead to all sorts of adventures, like the evening dinner dance. During and after dinner, a small dance band played quiet, mood-setting music, but the few husbands on board could not and did not have permission to make a dent in the demand for dance partners. A few fellows and girls who signed on as recreation directors couldn't help much either. We were asked once in a while if we could attend these dances. A bellhop on an ocean liner, let me remind you, ranks 2 steps below a seagoing third cook. It evidently didn't matter to the lonely passengers, however. They asked the captain if the steward's department could help out with the manpower shortage. The answer was a surprising, okay. So at least they got to dance with the young ladies on board. That turned out to be quite exciting. At least you got something to do. But as he continued along, Singapore. In the meantime, you may have noticed something concerning while I celebrated my birthday. His birthday is September 4th. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi troops poured across the Polish border, and by September 3rd, England had declared war against Hitler's Germany. I could see the handwriting staring me in the face. With what I had seen in Germany, Russia, and Japan, I felt certain that the United States would be at war up to its armpits. I could see my well-planned course of study in Cambridge, England, as a thing of the past. A telegram from Dad confirmed my suspicion, Cambridge off. So of course, as he kept that, I found the RCA radiogram, the telegram that he got on board saying, On our run from Manila to Singapore, I did a lot of thinking. I was part English and part German. I was on my way to an English college, and the USA would be in the war soon enough. I was a trained seaman, so, QED, why not join the British Navy? Then when the States got into the war, I could transfer to the US Navy as a battle-experienced officer. By the time we pulled into Singapore, I had it all thought out and was ready to join His Majesty's service. Several cables arrived from home. One arrived from my mother, sister, and dad wishing me a happy birthday. The other from my dad, very businesslike, said, Cambridge off. Interesting possibility with General Foods. Awaiting early return. So, you're not going anywhere, pal. You stay on board and you get your butt home, is basically what that said. Many years later, after World War II ended and I had done my stint in American uniform as an Army technical sergeant, my dad admitted to me that he knew perfectly well that I planned to join the British Navy. He also admitted that he knew me well enough to know that if he had said, I know what you're thinking and don't do it, I would have rushed right down double time and signed up. He was right. By not telling me what to do and by reminding me what a wonderful girl I had waiting, what a fine job opportunity I had before me, and so on, he knew I would think twice. So don't tell him not to do it, just think about it, and he made the decision on his own. So that was the second part of it. So the part of the trip coming all the way home was rather exciting because, as you remember from the diagram I showed you, where did they have to go? They had to go through the Indian Ocean, up the Suez Canal, through the Mediterranean. And by the time they got to the Mediterranean, it was about the end of August, and things were getting, or in October, things were getting kind of spicy. Neutral American ship, yes, but there were submarines around and German warships and all kinds of things. So he said they painted American flags all over the ship, tell them it was American and so forth. When he got back, an interesting little story, he found out that while they had stopped in China, the Chinese were battling the Japanese. The Chinese were buying American arms and armament. Not quite what you're supposed to be doing as a neutral country, providing arms to belligerents. So the Chinese had placed on board this ship $16 million in gold bullion to be brought back, paid for what they were doing. So this neutral ship was carrying $16 million worth of gold bullion of Chinese money, which kind of made them not so neutral anymore. So nobody knew about it, thank goodness. Not until they got back did he find that story out. So there are 83 stories in this book, and they're all kind of like the same thing. They're my father, different than I knew, but I'm glad I did all this because I really learned a lot about somebody that I didn't know from at that age. What prompted him to do this? In 1983, my father and mother had been retired, took a cruise. They went on safaris, they went on cruises, they went on canal boats in England. They did all kinds of things. They were quite dynamic. My mother found out that the Sea Cloud was now a windjammer. It was for hire. So she, until not telling my father, booked a cruise on board the Sea Cloud for the two of them. So they get up, drive, get where they're going, get out. My father's walking down the pier, sees the ship, recognizes immediately, bursts into tears, and has the best cruise ever. Because he went on board, and everybody wanted to talk to him, because they wanted to know what was it like working on board this ship in 1937 when it was a private yacht owned by these very wealthy people. And he wanted to know what it was like working on board the ship in 1983 with male and female crew members working on board as a sailing ship. So he had run of the ship, he went everywhere, talked to everybody, they exchanged sea stories my mother never saw them. The whole time they were on board the cruise except for meals, but he had a wonderful, wonderful time. Came back to Florida, told all his neighbors, he was thrilled to death, told them all about that and the Sea Cloud, and of course, and that reminisced back to the 1930s. Well, I was on board that ship as a kid doing this, and a couple of other summers I also did some other things, and that led to some other stories, and some of his friends said, geez, Peel, these stories are really good. You ought to write a book. Well, unknown to anybody in the family, he actually did. Because my mother never knew this existed, I never knew this existed, my sister never knew this existed. So my father did this, wrote it, put it in a drawer, in probably 1987, 1988 time period, and it just kind of sat there. He died in the year 2000. Nobody told her, my mother didn't know anything about this. And it didn't come to light until a couple years ago when I opened up this box and started to find all this stuff. So that's the story of the story. The stories, if you like sea stories, are fabulous. They're just a lot of fun. And I'm going to stop talking. And anybody have any questions? I can answer yes.
I do. I have two questions.
Sure.
My first question is, did your dad send you off on summer adventures when you were young?
Not really. No. I was, we moved around a lot. No, I didn't have any of those exciting things. When I was a kid, most of my summers in high school, junior high and high school, were spent on Cape Cod.
That's exciting.
My parents and my father and his sister, my cousins, we both vacationed. My grandparents owned a house on Cape Cod, so we went there for the summer. So most of my summers were spent frolicking around, riding bicycles barefoot, and all that kind of stuff on Cape Cod for the summer. I got my experience seagoing after I graduated from college. I went in the Navy. 1968 was a good time to volunteer rather than wait around to be drafted. So I volunteered for Navy. I was accepted at Officer Candidate School, went to Newport, Rhode Island, and spent 3 years on active duty off Vietnam. I stayed in the reserves, and I retired a Navy captain after 27 years. At the same time, I was a banker. So I have nothing to do with writing, nothing nearly as exciting as what my father did. I was a banker for 39 years, and that's not all that exciting, but it was something to do. And I did kind of keep my toe in the water by staying in the Naval Reserve.
What kind of vessel were you on off of? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
You had
do
another-
your first one before I get my second. Go for it.
What kind of vessel were you on off of Vietnam?
I was on board a helicopter carrier, LPH. It's like a small helicopter, it's like a small aircraft carrier whose job
What was the name?
was the USS Tripoli, LPH-10. And it was a squadron of 4 ships, and the job was to deliver a Marine battalion and the Marine aircraft helicopters to a battlefield, take them out, patch them up, send them back. So we had a hospital on board the ship I was on. There were 500 men in the crew and 1,500 Marines. All got seasick at one point or another.
Without climbing the mast.
And my job, I was the assistant navigator and the assistant combat information center officer. So I was busy doing shipboards type things.
You guys in the Gulf of Tonkin?
Excuse me?
You in the Gulf of Tonkin?
We were on the outskirts of that. We were mostly off Da Nang and south, where the Marines were doing their things, going in and out. So that's kind of where we were stationed. I did 2 tours on board the same ship. I got out a little early and went into the banking, started at Chase Manhattan Bank in New York, ended up with a Citizens Bank in Vermont, and just stayed in the Navy through the reserve through that period of time. So that's my naval water connection to stuff that my father did. Not nearly as exciting as the stuff that he did, believe me. Yes? You got another question?
I do, yeah, I thought I was looking at you. I think you said in the letter from your grandfather, you used the term darka, I think, at places you got sent, he was getting sent to or something he was doing one of those summers.
Oh.
Darka or Dhaka, I'm not sure what you...
Oh, okay, let me see.
It's in the letter, yeah.
He, probably just mumbling.
It's a Russian summer home?
Let me see what he said.
Dhaka, yeah.
Dhaka?
Yeah.
It's a Russian summer home?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that, okay.
If it's the same one.
I didn't know that.
Well, he went to all those 7 places. He went through Dartmouth.
Dhaka.
Oh, you said Dartmouth?
It was Dartmouth.
Oh, okay.
So he didn't go to Dartmouth, he did go to college, he just went to a different college than my grandfather planned. But he did go to the West Indies, he went to Holland, he went to England, went to the Mediterranean, was on a Gloucester fisherman, went around the world, went to college, and was planning to go for a year at a European university. 1932, my grandfather had that plan. That's the amazing part, that he actually did most of it. Yes, sir.
Did your grandfather have any siblings? No, right, your grandfather. No, did your father have any siblings?
My father had a sister. Yep.
And was she exposed to adventure?
No, she stayed at home. And I knew that because there are lots of letters from her to her brother in those boxes. So I could tell what was going on. And this is one of the things that took a while. Some of their handwriting is not the best. So it took a while for me to get through these and read and try to, first of all, understand what was going on, which was good because I kind of got the home front and Dad's at the same time what was going on. But I could kind of get the feel, on both sides how that was happening. One other thing I didn't mention, I also found this little packet of letters, just like this, wrapped up. Said, okay, this must be something special. What are these? These are 19 letters that then Nadinia Hutton, the year after my father served on board the Sea Cloud, when she was 14 and he was 20, they maintained a correspondence for a year. So I have a year's worth of her letters that she wrote to him that my father kept. And I've spent some time trying to contact heirs of Dina Merrill to find out if, by chance, do they have a box that their parents left in their attic, and is there maybe a little bundle of letters that might look like this that she might have kept on the other side. I was never really able to contact anyone until about 4 weeks ago. I found Dina Merrill was married 3 times. She had 3 husbands. I found her oldest son, who's my age, lives in Greenwich, Connecticut. I found it quite by accident. I've been looking, trying to find it. I finally found some legal document that he was a signer to, and it happened to have his name and address. So I just took a stab. I wrote him a letter and said, I'm not sure if you are, but if you are the son of Dean and Merrill, I have a little story to tell you. I wrote a little letter to him. About 3 weeks later, I got a letter back from him and said, yes, in fact, you have found the son of Dean and Merrill, and that's quite an amazing story, and I'm sure her mother would have been aghast to know that her 14-year-old daughter was carrying on a 1-year correspondence relationship with a 20-year-old sophomore, or 21-year-old junior. And we've exchanged some things. I've talked to his wife, we've exchanged some things. Her son is working on a family history, and just they'd be interested, so I'm going to send these letters to them, and so on and so forth. So I finally have made a contact somewhere.
The original letters or copies?
Depends on what they want.
Wow.
I would prefer to send them copies. The transcribed letters are all actually in the back of the book, so I transcribed them all. But if they wanted to see the originals, I would be more than happy to, to accommodate them as well.
And
So
there's
that's the story.
no stack of letters on their side?
No, nobody has ponied up a stack of letters yet. So, I doubt that they exist. They've probably long gone somewhere. But I just kind of always keep thinking, gee, wouldn't, because every one of her letters start off the same way. They all kind of start off and say things like, thanks so much for your grand letter. Or, sit down before you read this or you might fall down.
Oh, that sounds good.
Thanks so much for the long book. I owe you another letter, and here it is. So I know it took place. I just have no idea what he wrote. I can imagine now, knowing all this, not what I would have imagined before, but I imagine now that they were probably kind of interesting.
I can't imagine that he didn't tell you any of this growing up.
All I knew was some sea stories that he told us. I knew about the sea cloud because obviously when he came back from that cruise, we got into that flow. We know the sea cloud, and he did tell us some of the stories about that part. But he wasn't one that kind of opened up. My sister went down and visited them in Florida a lot more than I did. She really didn't know much more about this than I did either. My mother doesn't remember him doing this at all. So I don't know why that happened and why it got buried.
Yeah.
But I will leave you. If you have boxes like this, make sure you look at them and ask people when they're around to ask them the questions. As I say at the end of the book, the one regret I have is I have 1,000 questions I would like to ask my father now, and I don't have the opportunity to ask him.
And was your mom passed by the time you were opening boxes?
Yes.
So you couldn't ask her
Yes.
either? Yeah.
Yep. So nobody's there to ask. I can only imagine. I have to try and invent what might have happened. But based on all that, I would love to ask. It would take me a year to ask him all the questions that I would want to know and ask about. But my 30-second question would probably end up being a half-an-hour answer.
But one great gift is the fact that you wrote it out. At least you have that.
Yeah, at least I had the stories, and then could add all the other things to it to kind of to make it real. Otherwise, it's just a series of. They could just be sea stories. They could just be anything. And even when I read them, but once I was able to match a story to a diary, to a photograph, to a letter that I had as backup, okay, now these things are taking on in real life. Now they really did happen. Maybe they're embellished a little bit, maybe they happen a little bit differently, but probably not very much because the evidence is right here. It's kind of like from the lawyer's point of view, there was an awful lot of evidence that pointed to that.
Oh, you're quite the researcher.
So I had all this stuff and I said, what am I going to do? I'm not a writer, I'm not an author, I had no inkling how I was going to try to do this. So, yeah, sitting down with the publisher, and it took us about a year to put this together, and I'm just glad I did. I finished the project, whatever his intentions were, this is the finished project. So I feel good about that. Yes.
How long was it after your dad got back from his last adventure before he met your mom, or did they already know each other?
He met her and they got married in 1941. So 2 years after he graduated from college.
Okay.
And then he went in the Army and spent 2.5 years in the Army in World War II. So in amongst another one of these boxes is a scrapbook about this thick that my mother kept of everything, every fort, every camp, every station my father went to, every piece of paper he sent back, everything that she sent to him. She was a pack rat just like him. She saved everything. I mean, included in this box, I mean, it's things like, this is their wedding album that's in here. I found in here, my father was a little bit of an artist, so my father, among other things he did, he drew cartoons. So when he moved to Florida, he was the political cartoonist for their local newspaper. So he did that for 6 years. He started doing that when he was in high school.
What an interesting man.
A person I would love to have sat down and talked a lot to about all these things. And I found out about it after the fact. Of all
Well, at least you have that. At least you have those 2 boxes.
So if you have boxes, look at them, ask people. Don't let them sit there until it's too late. Because then you can only imagine. Of course, imagining is fun too. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you coming.
Thank you so much for sharing, yeah.
Yes, that was excellent.
And if you are interested in getting a book, I have some at some point, or you can, I think it's in some I have in some libraries. You can also buy it on Amazon, or you can buy it at Barnes & Noble. But it's kind of a fun book. It's kind of fun to just sit down. The nice part about it is you don't have to think about anything. There's no long, involved plot that you have to worry about. It's 83 little stories, and they're all different. It's just 83 little pieces of just enjoy and thinking about a kid between 14 and age 22 doing this by himself.
It's like a coming-of-age story.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, it is.
Wow.
Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.